Similar to this is there's web services out there that go out to the internet. There's also built-in system services that you can interact with from Enyo. So these are things that are device or hardware specific, stuff that doesn't typically come up in most web applications, with some exceptions like GPS. The accelerometer is one, camera, connection management. So if I need to go and I want to look at signal strength and all those kinds of things. Key management, which is for doing secure data store, key value pair storage, system info, application manager, which is one we'll look at. So things that the device supports, you can also interact with in most cases from Enyo.
Robert?
That's done with, yes.
I'm sorry, this is Jonathan. I know there's been some discussion, given that the touchpad has serial port profile for Bluetooth, but not a GPS chip, to create a service to access an external Bluetooth GPS through serial port protocol. Since GPS is generally report through standard types of information, that would allow users to basically bootstrap external GPSs into the touchpad. Is that something that's been mentioned, thought about, possible? If not, I'd like to submit it for consideration, because there are a lot of location-based apps where an inexpensive Bluetooth GPS would make a huge difference.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. So the first question, I don't recall hearing anything specific about something like that that's in the works, or that maybe any third parties are working on. It's definitely something that I'll float back to the engineering teams. We have pretty good access to them. In fact, there's a guy on the developer relations team, which I'm part, whose primary role is kind of care and feeding of engineering requests from people like us, vis-a-vis the community. So I can do that. To build something like that, if you were interested in doing that yourself, I'm not terribly familiar with how deep the exposure to things like USB would be through the service framework on the device. If there are interfaces there's well-documented, in fact, there's even samples in the SDK, ways of rolling your own Palm services, basically. In a more in-depth discussion with more time, I'd go through a simple example of that. But basically, you can build your own services that you interact with in the same way that you're similar to what you're seeing on the screen now. So the hooks are there from the Enyo side. Whether or not there's exposure for USB from the actual public service bus on the device for USB specifically,
it would not actually be USB. It's straight Bluetooth, serial port protocol.
Yeah, so similar. There's a Bluetooth service built into the public bus, which again I don't know. I imagine there is. I'd have to check into that. But if so, you could roll your own service that talked to Bluetooth, and then you would implement your own protocol that would basically talk whatever format, etc. your GPS you needed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so yeah, I'll throw that up with the guys on the engineering side and see what they say. So building your own service, or actually interacting with an existing service, is pretty simple. There's another Enyo product called Palm Service. You specify the service property is the URL. Is how the services are named. So there's a variety of them. This example is showing the application manager, because the next example I'm going to show uses it. And this is the service that lets you launch other applications on the device. You can specify the method that you're going to call that's implemented by the service, in this case open. So when I go with Palm Service, it's going to let me launch applications. The way that I would do that then, in code, once I've created that Palm Service instance, is using the call method that's implemented on the Palm Service kind, and the ID of the application that I want to launch, because in this case it's specifically tied to the application manager, and then a set of parameters, which in this case is a URL, which then what will happen is the browser would launch pointing to the developer.palm.com URL. So let's take a look at what that might look like. I'm going to show you an example application. This was not built by me, but this was built by a member of the team, the enterprise team, called Discover Stuff. And this one's a little more exciting. Make sure I've got the internet here. This is basically going to integrate a bunch of stuff we've been talking about. Obviously, Enyo UI components. So here you see again a multi-pane with sliding panes kind of user interface for the application. Headers, etc. Some group robots and row grouping for different types of content. This application is then also going to use the web service kind to be able to call Yahoo Local Search through the YQL APIs. So do things like look up, for example, like you see pizza in certain zip codes. And then it's also going to use the native services, specifically the application manager, to launch things like the browser to pull up maps. And since pizza is a little less interesting than things like beer, let's enter beer as my search term. And a little bit closer to home, I live in the 94022 zip code in California. And if I say search, I get a list of things that support beer in my area. So there's lots of, kind of scary liquor stores, there's some restaurants, there's wine shops, etc. Again, this is in a virtual list. And I can click on any one of these. So what's the beer garden, which I've actually never heard of, in Menlo Park. And it pulls up the details, gives you the phone number if there is one in the search results, a URL, and a map. So pretty handy. Now again, not necessarily an award-winning user UI, but if you were building this kind of application or service, you can take code like this for the core pieces. How do I do mapping? How do I do AJAX calls into this kind of API, REST or otherwise? How do I build a UI that has this multi-pane look and feel? I can take a sample like this and use it to my heart's content. From the code perspective, let's go back into Notepad++. Go out to where the source lives, Discover Stuff. And as we've been seeing, every application has the same basic structure, and all the interesting stuff lives in the source. There's discoverstuff.js, and there's something called Stuff Services, and this is where things like the API calls happen and the web service calls, etc. So let's start with that. Let's kind of browse through some of this stuff briefly to give you a kind of a sense of how an application like this works. So to do the local search, I'm using, or the application's using, the Enyo web service. And again, this is the kind that Enyo provides for doing quick and dirty AJAX calls. And I commented on the URL because I actually specify it down when I do the service call. So we'll get to that in a second. I can specify the on-success and on-failure methods. These are, depending on the actual response code that I get back in the AJAX call. If it works, God stuff will happen. And then basically what I do there is I go through the response, which is going to be, basically, I think in this case it's returning JSON, JSON formatted objects that contain all of the information for that local search. Things like, address, phone number, lat long, etc. And I just fill that into the search results, which is that list, each element in that list. So that's how I populate the UI. The actual web service call happens in this get stuff method. So basically, the Yahoo Local Search is the name of the web service instance that we created to do the lookups. I can programmatically define or specify the URL, and I'm basically calling through Yahoo APIs and local search. I specify programmatically the zip code that I entered and the format, the resulting format, JSON or XML, the zip code, etc. And then I make the call method call. So this call method is defined on the Enyo.web service kind. And that's how you make any web service call, whether this is to Yahoo APIs or to anything else. Now doing the map, I'm sorry, let's look at the main UI first. So this is, again, this is the Enyo UI stuff. Here's the header, the search bar, if you will, where I have my, what I'm searching for, pizza, beer, etc., zip code. There's a button to do the search. Here's all the panes, the sliding panes, kind of similar to the other samples we were looking at for building up the UI. Again, I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but you see basically the same kind of Enyo structure using more and more Enyo UI elements than we've been doing in the past.
I had a quick question, a small technical one. I noticed the kind definitions are, some of them are strings and some of there are references to objects. So it's like there's a Enyo H flex layout. And then in other ones are, like in your example earlier, right, it was quoted around it as a string. What is the difference between doing them in those manners?
I think there's no difference.
Okay.
So I think if you have quotes or not, it'll work. I just am used to everything being like JSON, so I have quotes.
Okay.
Let's see. Another example of one of the things that happens, like when I click on the link. So if I go back to the application, see more on the Oasis Beer Garden. It's going to try to call the service. On the device, this would work, since the way it's loading the URL is to look and see the application manager. There is no Palm in the application manager on my desktop, of course, so it thinks there's some plugin that has to be installed. But basically, if you click on the URL, it's going to use the, like we were showing in the slides before, the application manager Palm service to load the browser. Now you could do this another way as well. There's a component in Enyo called a web view, which is basically a browser. So it's a browser control. And I can add that to an application as a component and have it load up web content for me. So another way, and probably an easier way, that you could do the same thing would be to use WebView to load this URL. But this example was meant to show how to use both web services as well as local device services. I'll talk a little bit about Enyo and HTML5 support. Actually, we should probably start by just talking about HTML5 support in webOS in general. Again, given that the device and the platform is strongly WebKit based, we have very good HTML5 support. There's some things that are not there. For example, looking at the bottom here, some missing pieces, things like web workers, for example. So if you want to build multi-threaded, asynchronous HTML5 applications using web workers, that's something that's not currently supported. But most of the core HTML5 features that most people are using for applications are supported in our WebKit implementation. So Canvas being a big one. Local storage is there, supported in geolocation, video and audio work, and there's plenty more. A good way to find out the full range of support is to hit a URL like html5test.com. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It basically goes through all of the HTML5 features and tests whether or not your browser supports them, gives you a score, and our browser rates pretty highly. It's pretty close to I think 300 in that test. So